As Standard & Poor's, when we rate sovereign credits, we look at 5 key factors. We look at policy effectiveness, which is our most qualitative category. We look at the so-called economic assessment, which is anchored in levels of absolute productivity in an economy, as well as our view on potential growth prospects for an economy. We have a fiscal category, which is based on both a fiscal flow and stock score. We have an external category, which looks at the net international investment position of a country, and also looks at a flow measurement of the external side, mostly the current account position. We also take a view on monetary credibility, and we certainly do reflect positively those sovereigns which have global reserve currencies, because we do view those as things which improve sovereign creditworthiness, particularly in a crisis situation. Our assessment of the European policy response so far to the Eurozone debt crisis has been that it's been rather one-sided in focusing exclusively on cuts to public consumption, cuts to public investment, i.e. fiscal consolidation, to the point where it's become self-defeating, rather than also coming up with a growth plan. Because when you look at the sovereign balance sheet, what you have is a numerator, which is the stock of public debt, which is the accumulation of past deficits, and you have the denominator, which is growth, which is nominal GDP. And clearly the denominator matters at least as much as the numerator. As you know, under Standard & Poor's criteria, the Greek debt exchange we have viewed as a default. As a result of the exchange, Greek public debt at the end of this year, even if they meet the current growth targets, will continue to be very high, about 160% of GDP. How has this changed our approach to sovereign ratings or to Europe? In many ways, we still see Greece as an outlier, particularly given our view that there are institutional inadequacies in Greece which led to very poor tax administration, very low tax pressure, to increasing political uncertainty most recently. And we think the other members of the Eurozone, even the program countries like Portugal, like Ireland, have proven themselves to be very committed to consolidating their fiscal positions, to moving ahead with politically contentious structural reforms. So in that way, I would say it hasn't really directly impacted our sovereign criteria. But I do think if Greece were to leave the Eurozone, if it were to exit, that certainly could set off fairly unpredictable consequences for financial sector external stability in other members of the euro, which would be difficult to predict and could be very growth negative. It's also important sometimes to remember that Europe has strengths. These strengths include one of the world's most competitive export sectors. The real effective exchange rate is actually depreciating in Europe, and the very competitive exporters like Germany and the Netherlands, for example, remain quite resilient economies. Germany in particular, if you look at a sector like the auto sector, if you look at how large their margins are compared to many of their Asian and even North American competitors, these are economies which still are quite resilient, but you obviously, I think, need to take a very cautious view on ultimately the solution to how to deal with a monetary union which is not a fiscal union and which is not a political union. And this raises enormous questions about the success of the economic and fiscal adjustments in places like Spain, where the banks will need more capital.